Good evening. My name is Christy Keeler, and I am the Purina sales specialist that works with Farmers Cooperative and all of their locations across western Arkansas and eastern Oklahoma. We appreciate you taking the time to join us for our bi-weekly Tuesday night cattle chat series. Just to remind you folks, if this is your first time, all of the lines are muted. If you have joined us via Zoom tonight, down in the bottom left-hand portion of your screen, you would see a join audio, give you an opportunity to dial in and listen to us via headset or on the phone. If you got any questions tonight for Dr. Peel, please drop those questions into the Zoom chat box. If you're joining via a Zoom mobile app, it would be clicking down in the bottom portion where it says more with the three little dots. A window will pop up that will say chat, and just type your questions in there. If you're joining us in Zoom, via the computer, and the bottom right hand or the bottom of your screen, in the middle of that should be a little chat icon, and drop those questions in there. If you're catching us on our Facebook live stream, we will be continually monitoring the comment box in the live. Drop those questions in, and what we'll do is we'll answer those questions towards the end. Let us know where you're joining us tonight from. Dr. Peel has already asked that as we've gotten started this evening, just making sure we've got our audio and connections going. So one little fun thing that we would like to do tonight is kind of launch a little poll here. And one of those questions, just to kind of get a feel of what our audience got going on, is, are you guys planning on selling your calf crop straight off the cow? Do you wean calf crop for 21 or more days? And have you participated in a special calf marketing sale? So this will just help us as we get into some Q&A, and that way we can give this feedback to Dr. Peel. For those of you guys that are joining us in Facebook or on Facebook, please just drop a comment in there for us. So with that being said, I'm going to leave this poll going for a little bit as we've got some folks still joining in. Dr. Peel, it's a pleasure to have you on our platform tonight. I know you and I go a little ways back, go back to the college days of being there at Oklahoma State University, and remember your knowledge while I was there, and I appreciate you taking the time out of your evening to join us. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to you.
All righty, Christy, thank you very much. Appreciate Purina sponsoring these meetings. Excuse me, it's ragweed season and I'm struggling a little bit, but so I'm going to start sharing my screen now. And we'll talk a little bit about these cattle markets for a bit. Obviously, if you have questions, we'll take care of those at the end. And so I think we'll just we'll get right into it and take a look a little bit. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on where we've been. Obviously, the first half of the year was just a tremendous challenge. With the volatility, all of the issues we were dealing with, obviously not just in the cattle markets or even in ag markets, but the entire economy. And we're still in that, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But, one of the things that as we get into the second half here, moving through the third quarter, we're beginning to see, at least from a cattle market perspective, some of that starting to settle down a little bit. And I'm not going to call it normal yet. I'm not sure what that even is going to be at some point, but we're sort of, reestablishing some of the normal market relationships, kind of getting things back in line. One of the things that came out of the first half of the year for cattle markets that has been a huge challenge was the severe disruption that we had in harvest capability in April and May. We didn't slaughter a lot of cattle when they were ready to be slaughtered during that time period, and we carried those cattle over. At least we we were able to maintain those animals, unlike the hog industry where we had some depopulation that became necessary because of those delays. We didn't do that in cattle, but that meant that we carried a lot of cattle into the second half of the year in feedlots that we've been working to clean up, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. I think we've made remarkable progress actually on that, but that was certainly a big challenge for a while. Obviously, we are not past all of this pandemic stuff yet. We still have issues. We're struggling with it in terms of the actual public health concerns, and that's going to be there for a while, it looks like. Couple with that the fact that we are in a significant recession in the U.S. and globally, and we're sort of watching to see how that's going to impact our markets going forward. It's going to take some time, clearly, to move past that. We're not completely sure yet how the impacts, again, from a beef market perspective, will play out. So we'll talk about that. We're going to be watching demand very closely as we finish out this year and move into next year, still dealing with those macroeconomic challenges, looking at the situation both domestically and in terms of the international markets that are important to our industry. So we'll be watching the demand side very carefully from that standpoint. And then we'll talk a little bit about where we're going to be for beef production. I'll show you kind of our current forecast for the rest of the year and into next year from a supply standpoint. And that'll sort of set the stage for what we look at in these markets, not only for the rest of this year, but as we go beyond that level. Just to start off, a backdrop here. I'm not going to talk a great deal about it, but obviously we've had some regions of the country, particularly in the western half of the U.S., that have struggled with drought conditions. That has included, western Kansas, parts of western Oklahoma, and the Panhandle, and western Texas. And it's kind of come and gone, but it's been pretty persistent through that region. There's some areas now in the Midwest that have evolved over the last few weeks. I didn't put together a series of these, but you can sort of, we've seen the drought conditions expand a little bit. So in some regions, we've got some forage concerns. We've got some hay concerns. I don't know that on a bigger picture scale that we really have forage issue. And, right now we've had hurricanes and lots of rain and flooding in some areas, which is the other problem. And so all of those things obviously impact individuals and certain regions and so on. So that's kind of a backdrop here. I'll talk a little bit, I think I have a slide or two about sort of the feed market situation and what we expect from that standpoint. So just a quick review of kind of cattle markets. I like to use a series of charts here to look at different classes of cattle, where we are and have been this year compared to a year ago. So this is a Southern Plains calf price series that shows, and you can see actually for about the last 2 to 3 months, 2.5 months, we've been running pretty close to year ago levels. Now, if you'll remember, 2019, the second half of the year was a little bit disappointing. We struggled a lot more than we thought we would. But given what happened in, earlier in 2020, and you can see that here in the second quarter in particular, where we were way below year ago levels, we didn't really get our second quarter market peak. We kind of took out that seasonality as we got into the pandemic impacts and the economic shutdown that we went through at that time. But we've come back to year ago levels, and I'll speak specifically to the price forecast at the end as we get there. But we're looking at markets that have recovered, relative to the impacts of earlier in the year. And we've seen, now the calf prices have been a little more volatile. Feeder cattle prices, again, pretty significant recovery from those second quarter impacts. And we're still at levels pretty close to this time last year as we go in, through the third quarter here and looking towards the end of the year. Fed cattle markets have been extremely volatile this year with just several waves of impacts. Really started a little bit earlier in these markets with the initial concerns really internationally even before it hit in the U.S. back as early as February. We began to see some impacts in fed cattle markets. One brief spike up in the early in the second quarter, and then the big impacts in the second quarter. and even bigger impacts in the third quarter, towards the end of the second quarter, when we got into that backlog of cattle, if you will, which we've sort of worked our way out of. Again, we're kind of at year-ago levels at this point. So we're sort of, for everything we've been through, we're kind of hanging in there, again, relative to that, and we'll talk about the situation going forward. Tremendous impacts in meat markets, tremendous disruption. Again, that it started in March with the shutdown. We took about half of our food industry and closed it off in terms of the food service, the restaurant side, and shoved all of the demand into the grocery store side. That created enormous disruption and contortions in those markets. And then, of course, the shortage of meats that happened. First quarter beef production, I think I actually have a chart coming up here, but first quarter beef production was above a year ago by about 8%. Second quarter beef production was down about 11% from a year ago. So we just went from one extreme to the other, and then we bounced back here again through the summer and thus far into the fall, with beef production actually running a little bit above a year ago. To round it out a little bit, cull cow prices actually were pretty strong through the summer, above year-ago levels. Now they have dropped off just in the last 2 or 3 weeks. I think that's probably early seasonal impacts. We normally have a pretty pronounced fall low for cull cows, with the majority of the cattle in the country, cows in the country being spring calving cows. We do a lot of culling in the fall, and so we normally see an October to November low in these markets. But we have seen it pull back a little bit in the last 2 or 3 weeks, which may be an early start to that process. If you back up a little bit and look at a bigger picture and a longer term picture, in July we got mid-year estimates for where we are with overall cattle numbers. The all cattle and calves inventory was essentially unchanged from a year ago. Beef cows were down in July, and they were down a similar amount actually on a year-over-year basis in January. So what that says is that cow numbers in particular, peaked in 2019. We're a little bit smaller here in 2020. And one of the questions going forward with again, all we've been through and all of the economic pressure, are we expecting more liquidation or not? And I would say at this point that there's no indication that we're doing significant liquidation. But I think we are still kind of drifting smaller, if you will, to slightly smaller numbers. The 2020 calf crop is down, projected down. That's at the bottom of this table, down, less than 1%, but down from a year ago. I would expect that number will be a little bit smaller again in 2021. So we start to see these feeder supplies, this feeder pipeline tighten up a little bit. Again, I don't think we're doing massive liquidation. The beef replacement heifers were unchanged from a year ago. So, we're just keeping the same number of heifers. We're not really trying to grow, but I don't think we're really trying to get smaller at this point in time. And so, we're working through a pipeline of cattle that's still pretty big, carrying out from last year and carrying out from the disruptions earlier this year. But as we go through the last part of the year and into next year, we see those numbers tighten up just a little bit. Certainly, at least, mostly supportive to the market, not tremendously supportive in terms of pushing for a lot higher prices on a supply basis alone, but certainly supportive in the grand scheme of things. Again, this is the feedlot situation. We look at feedlot marketings. We did not market cattle in April and May because there was no place for them to go. And so those cattle got carried over, and we've been trying to catch up since then on those cattle, as well as any new cattle that were already scheduled to be finished in July and August and on into September now. Placements also dropped back early. In March and April, placements were way low. If you sort of count it out, and the weight breakdowns tell you a little bit more, but in general, low March and April placements translates into fewer cattle from that pool of cattle coming out of the feedlots right now in terms of late August, September, perhaps into the first part of October. And that's one of the reasons that I think we have largely caught up with any cattle we carried out of you know, the disruptions in April and May and June, I think we've largely moved through those numbers now. So the bottom line is the on-feed inventory, it actually went up. We had a big placement number in July on a year-over-year basis, and so that pushed the on-feed inventory about 2% above a year ago. But you know, cattle on feed over 90 days, this is a calculated number, but it kind of gives us an idea of sort of how current we are. And that number went way up in June, but came down in July and in August, again suggesting that we are much closer, if not not completely current in these feedlots. We'll get to the meat side of this and look at carcass weights here in just a little bit. You know, this is data out of Kansas. It's a survey of Kansas feedlots. We've had this data available now for 20 plus years. And this shows what's happened to the cost of gain. So I usually often have a corn price chart in here, but this amounts to the same thing. You can see, excuse me, that the cost of gain as reported by feedlots through the month of July had dropped pretty significantly from earlier in the year. And the bottom line is we are looking at ample feed supplies. Corn crop's not going to be a record crop now. We had a big windstorm in the Midwest that took out some corn recently. We've got some drought conditions now that may be cutting back a little bit on our yield estimates. But everything, you know, that said, we still have a very large crop and a significant supply of feed that's going to keep these prices fairly attractive going forward. Excuse me. Okay, so looking at the slaughter side, again, you can see the massive disruption. We had 1 week, the last week of April, where slaughter and beef production were both down nearly 40% on a year-over-year basis. And it was getting smaller all through the month of April. Then we started recovering, and it recovered through the month of May. And as we went into June, then we were back up pretty close to year-ago levels, and we've been running quite close to that, within 1 or 1.5% of a year-ago levels through the summer. And so we have been able to again, sort of get back to a little more normal flow. I think we're getting kind of back on track with the sort of standard flow after all of these disruptions. Carcass weights were heavy coming into the year anyway, suggesting that we were probably going to continue a long-term trend higher this year. And but then as we got into that backlog of cattle, obviously if you hold them 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks beyond when they really probably should have been marketed, then those carcass weights stayed high through the seasonal low over here in late April into May. We were running 50 pounds above a year ago on these steer carcasses, heifers similarly. And then, you know, we've just kind of maintained that going forward. Carcass weights normally have a pronounced seasonal increase in the last part of the year. And we're seeing that increase over here, but we are kind of converging on last year's levels. So I don't know if we're going to end up over here close to year-ago levels, or if we're going to maintain, you know, the kind of increase we had even before COVID hit. If we do, then that'll put us up here, you know, off the chart here in terms of where we'll be for the peak seasonal, peak carcass prices seasonally in October or November. So we're watching that. Now, when you think about slaughter being down part of the time, these carcass weights were helping to offset that. Right now, what we see is that slaughter is running close to year-ago levels, plus or minus 1%. It's been above some weeks and a little bit below some weeks. But when you take that times these bigger carcass weights, you get more beef production. Pretty consistently for many weeks now, we've been running a little bit above year-ago levels on beef production. And so to look at it across the other classes, cattle slaughter total is down about 4% for the year. Again, we've been above and below. Steers are down 5.7%, heifers down 4%. Beef cows are up 3.3%. I don't think that's indicative of, again, of significant liquidation, but we certainly have to watch it here, especially in the last part of the year. I think we'll probably end up with beef cow slaughter close to year-ago levels before the year's over, but if it stays above, then that may indicate a little more liquidation than than what I'm really anticipating at this point. This chart has quite a lot of numbers on it, but it really just summarizes here in the middle. These kind of orange colored boxes or columns sort of show you our current projections for the meat production this year, which kind of sets up a discussion of demand then. So beef production is still projected to be, we really didn't change this a great deal, actually. Even with all of the disruptions we had, the same number of cattle were out there. The question was when we would get them through the system, if you will. But by the time the year's over, our total beef production is going to be about what we thought it was coming into the year. And that'll be a record level of, here we've got 27.4 billion pounds. It may get tweaked up just slightly, but it's not going to change dramatically at this point. That will be a record level. Again, we've set records for the last several years. We're also looking at record pork production, 28.3 billion pounds, record broiler production, about 44.2 billion pounds. And so we've got record total meat production in the U.S., lots of protein supplies. And so that, sort of sets up then a part of the focus that we have on demand. There is a lot of protein. We are in a recession that affects spending power on the part of consumers. I would say to this point that we have done remarkably well maintaining consumer demand, particularly when you recognize that even yet today with a partial reopening, restaurants are still running 40 to 50% down on foot traffic compared to pre-COVID levels. So, we've had to make a lot of adjustments in where we're eating and to some extent what we're eating, but beef in particular has held up pretty well. I've got retail prices here in just a minute. So they did shoot up in May and June as a result of the overall shortage of meat supplies. They are coming back down. It takes some time, so they haven't dropped completely back down to prior levels, but they are adjusting down. And again, as strong as they are, would suggest that beef demand has held up pretty well through this process. In fact, if you look at beef compared to the other meats, so this top line is the ratio of retail beef prices to broiler prices or chicken prices in the grocery store. And we've actually been at record levels since early in this year with that. And again, that's pretty impressive in the face of record beef supplies and record poultry supplies. Same thing is true for beef to pork. That's the bottom red line here, record levels. So, again, we've had good domestic demand. We'll talk about the trade situation here in just a minute. That's going to be really important going forward after some of the disruptions we've seen in that. In fact, that's where we are now. Beef and veal exports dropped dramatically in May and June. Part of that was just lack of product. We did not produce the product with slaughter being down and beef production being down in April and May. And so we didn't have it to export. That was part of it, but some of it is the economic impacts on a global basis. And so we've been watching these markets pretty carefully. Year to date, if you sort of average pre-COVID and then the worst of the COVID period here through June, we've got total beef exports down nearly 8%, not quite 8%, with a mixture of impacts. Japan was up to that point for the first 6 months of the year, nearly 6%. It was down sharply in May and June alone, but for the whole 6 months it was up. Mexico is off dramatically. That's been a major impact there for our number 3 market. Hong Kong has been down. Canada's been up a little bit. And South Korea, which is our number 2 market, Japan's our number 1 market. South Korea's number 2, they've been down about 7%. So I've been watching this very closely. A lot of concerns after the disruptions in May and June. One of the things that we see here with a weekly chart, you can see that massive drop off in exports a few weeks ago, but you can also see that it has come back pretty pronounced. So that'll show up in that monthly data. In fact, we'll be getting the July monthly data here in just a few days. And that's going to show, I think, a significant recovery in those export levels pretty much across the board. If we look at, again, all of our major markets, it appears that we have recovered those markets pretty well. In addition to those major markets, and those have been our major 5 markets for a number of years, again, Japan, South Korea, Mexico, Hong Kong, and Canada. But in addition to that, we are seeing something we've been watching for and anticipating for a number of years, and that is we're seeing some significant growth in beef exports to China. You know, and that's coming from a fundamental growth in beef demand in China, coupled with a protein shortage that affected them primarily through their hog industry and continues to impact them. But we are seeing significant growth. Now, this is still a minor part of our total market. In the month of June, that record level, or nearly record level of monthly beef exports to China was about 2.4% of our total exports. So it's still a pretty small portion, but it has the potential over time to grow significantly. And we are seeing that growth begin. Again, there's reasons for the demand in terms of economic growth and protein situation in China. Obviously, there's lots of uncertainty about their economy, about trade tensions and all of those things as well. But this market has a lot of potential going forward. So our beef exports this year will probably be down a little bit. Here's the 2020 estimate, down a bit from last year. We've had to revise that down because in total, we're probably just not going to move quite as much beef as we thought, and expecting probably a little recovery in that as we go forward the next year or two. Beef imports has been up and down on a month-to-month basis as well. For the whole year, we're up about 3%. And again, that's a little bit of a mixed bag with quite a bit more meat coming in from Mexico, which is one of our major import markets as well, but down from Australia, Canada, kind of flat to New Zealand, up slightly, and so on. So again, we've seen lots of dynamics in those markets, both in terms of what has happened in the U.S. market, as well as what has happened in those countries in some cases. And then, of course, one of the factors that affects both beef exports and imports is exchange rates. That's going to reflect, again, the economic situation, I should say, in each of those countries on a pair by pair comparison as we look at those. So we watch that going forward. So beef imports will probably be close to year-ago levels, perhaps down slightly for the year, even though we're up first half of the year, probably tighten up a little bit, and holding fairly steady, but not growing certainly over the next couple of years as it looks right now. Okay, so this is a long-term big picture view of kind of what do we expect on average. So these are annual average prices, none of the short-run market volatility and the seasonality that we deal with, just on an annual average basis. 2020 is lower than we earlier thought. Obviously, we've been through a lot, but we're looking at significant growth or increased potential in calf markets, feeder cattle markets, or fed cattle markets over the next couple of years. So these are the current forecasts. Again, these are annual averages, so they take out a lot of things. Here's a bunch of numbers, if you like numbers, that go into a little more detail on those price forecasts. So for 2020, we're down here approaching the fourth quarter. We're looking at calf prices, again, probably slightly higher than a year ago. Again, we kind of saw that in that early chart where we're running right about year-ago levels. We think it'll probably continue that and stay at or slightly above year-ago levels. For the whole year, we're going to be down slightly, but again, if you look out to 2021 here on an annual basis, we're looking at the potential for 5 to 8% kind of increase in these prices over that time frame. Feeder cattle, a little bit harder time recovering towards the end of the year compared to a year ago. That may depend on the corn harvest, and it's going to depend on this feedlot situation. Feedlots, feedlot profitability has recovered pretty nicely in the last few weeks, and with that plus feed prices, cost of gain going forward, that's going to help support these feeder cattle markets a little bit. And again, looking at a fairly sizable kind of year-over-year increase out here for 2021. Fed cattle, again, we're pretty close to year-ago levels. This has got fourth quarter still running, 4% below a year ago. That's, I think that remains to be seen. That's kind of the way we're headed right now. It might not be quite that much when it's all said and done, but it's going to depend on these, the overall wholesale beef level from that standpoint, as well as the currentness of these feedlots. We'll be watching that going forward, and again, looking at a pretty significant year-over-year increase on an annual basis for 2021. So let's see, we're about 30 minutes into this, Christy, so I think, oh yeah, well, it must be close to the end. I thought I'd put this in here. I forgot about it, actually. I read something recently. There is research, I think this actually comes out of South Africa, that shows that if you paint eyes on the backsides of cows, they don't get attacked as often by predators. So I don't know what that does for us, but I thought it was kind of interesting. So that's, apparently there's research that backs that up. That said, I'll stop here. I do write a weekly newsletter. I don't sell anything, but if that's something you'd like to get, I do write weekly comments, and Dr. Glenn Selk is an animal scientist who does some really nice practical production type articles as well. We'd be happy to send that to you if that's something you're interested in. Otherwise, there's my email. If you want to get a hold of me or have questions, or if there's something I can help you with, please let me know. So that said, Christy, let's see if we got any questions.
Yeah, when we sure do. So I will speak up. I am one of those lovely people that have, I am on your weekly newsletter, and that is my go-to every Monday night. I sit down and read that to kind of get a good feel of what's going on. So appreciate you popping that up there. So Mr. Les has a couple of questions for us tonight, and I had some that came through on a text message as well. So Les has asked us, why didn't retail beef prices get reflected in price to, why don't retail beef prices get reflected in prices to the farmer?
Well, the answer to that is they do, but it doesn't happen instantaneously. There's lots of dynamics, many levels in this industry. They all do over a long period of time follow each other, but they sure don't, those dynamics take time to play out between the different sectors. And particularly when you have the kind of disruptions that we had this year, where we knew they weren't really long-lived. I mean, when you're in the middle of it, 8 weeks or something of disruption is pretty long, but in the grand scheme of things, not. So, prices reflect not only what's actually happening at this moment, but also expectations for the future. And so when you average all of that out, we don't see as much movement at all levels when you get those kind of shocks. But over time they are connected, and they do reflect the underlying supply and demand conditions.
So Dr. Peel, just to kind of add on to that a little bit, so we talk about from the retail, because we see these market prices, and to get it to the retail, how much of a gap time is there from what we see going on at the sale barn to going into the retail? How much of a gap time is there?
Well, just think about it. So, from the time, if we start at weaning, and we've already got 9 months of production into this calf, but from weaning, typically we're going to be, 15 to 20 months of age before that animal goes to slaughter. So you've already got, upwards of, a year and a half plus going in there. And then even once you get into, the animal's processed and as meat, a lot of that meat's going to be consumed within, say, 3 weeks of when it was processed, but doesn't really reflect always when the business was done. Grocery stores operate a little more in the current market because they sell more meat on a year-round basis. But if you think about restaurants and things, they don't price meat, or they don't like to price meat every week. They make 3 to 6 months to sometimes 12-month contracts, so they know what their menu prices are going to be. They don't change menus every week. And so there's a lot of lags in there in terms of the way the business deals get done. That's really a little bit different than just the actual, sort of logistics of the flow of fresh product through the system.
Perfect, thank you. So Lee dropped in another question. Does higher slaughter weight put downward pressure back to the cow-calf producer?
Sure. You know, again, total beef production, it really comes down to the total level of production. So it's not about the number of animals. Ultimately, it's about total production. So we have to take into account that carcass weight. You know, through much of the summer, I haven't calculated this for a few weeks now, but during much of the summer, the added carcass weights were the equivalent of about another 23 to 25,000 head of slaughter a week, if you compared it to year-ago levels. And so, you know, it's like having more cattle when you have those heavier carcass weights. So yeah, they definitely do figure into the overall supply of beef and the beef prices that we would see, the wholesale prices, and then that backs up through the system through fed cattle and feeder cattle and calf markets to some degree. And again, it depends on how long it lasts, and it's not an immediate impact necessarily. There's dynamics in every level of these markets, but over time, all of those factors are important.
Perfect. So and then Les has asked, so where does China get most of their beef?
China has, I didn't show it. This is going to be a slightly longer answer than you asked, than the question you asked, but to set the stage, China was never a factor in global markets for many, many years until about 6 years ago. Their imports started to rise pretty dramatically. In the last 2 or 3 years, they have been the biggest beef importing country in the world by a significant factor. The US was the biggest for many, many years. China exceeds us now by about 2.5 times, particularly if you figure China and Hong Kong together. So they have been buying a lot of beef. They get most of that from Australia, New Zealand, Argentina, and Brazil. So the South American countries and Australia and New Zealand have been the principal sources of that beef up to this point. They have not imported a lot in terms of their total volume from the US or really from anywhere in North America, but it is beginning to grow.
So Miss Yvonne has asked, in the market, and in the market in her area, there's many custom butcher shops that are booked in the middle of 2021. And I've seen quite a bit about that on Facebook, you know, guys trying to find places to harvest their own animals because producers are not selling direct to the consumer. Does that number reflect in the consumer numbers you have shared?
Yes, I mean, you know, to the extent that we can. The consumer per capita consumption, it is a calculated number. We sort of back it out of production minus the uses. And then that's a little more detail than you really wanted to know probably. But there's 2 categories of slaughter. We have federally inspected slaughter, which is the vast majority of total slaughter. But we also then have commercial slaughter. Commercial slaughter would add in those small plants, state inspected plants, even home slaughter to the extent that it can be captured in the data. I won't say it's perfect. And it only represents about I think it's 1.8% of total slaughter is that difference between federally inspected and total. But it is captured in there to the extent possible. So yeah, and you're absolutely right. Obviously with the disruptions we've had, and the changes in eating patterns that we've had, at-home consumption, less food service, restaurant type things, we've had a lot more interest in local slaughter, small scale or custom slaughter plants, that kind of thing. You know, there's quite a bit of interest in seeing that expand. And all of that is, I mean, it's going to be helpful to some individuals with specific market opportunities. Some of it, I think, will probably not persist going forward. There was a lot of initial interest, and some of it will go away, but I suspect some of it's permanent. And so, so we will probably see some increase in that. In the grand scheme of things, for perspective, it's still a very, very tiny proportion of our total beef industry.
Okay. So I had a couple of text messages that came across. Can you ask Dr. Peel about the current market? It seems like prices are a little high. $145 for 6-weight steers, and 90 cents on mature bulls. What is causing this, and how long would you anticipate for those prices to last?
That almost sounds like we want them to go back down. I don't get that very often from cattle meetings, but we have seen in general. Go ahead.
Well, and I think more than anything is that spread, right? That spread between those mature bulls and those steers.
Yeah, and honestly, I haven't looked at the bull prices as much. You know, there's, again, bulls, slaughter bulls and slaughter cows are going to largely be driven by that hamburger market. And so, you know, there's things that go on in that market that are different than the normal sort of feeder cattle market and the flow of feedlot production. So we have generally seen these markets improve over the summer. It's been kind of a slow, bumpy grind for feeder cattle anyway. I would assume the cull bulls, and I'm saying this as an assumption because I honestly haven't looked and I don't have a chart of it, but have probably kind of followed the cull cow prices a little bit. They're not as seasonal as the cows because there's not as many of them, and they don't have the same kind of seasonal culling kinds of things, but they're going to really be driven by that, largely by that processing beef market.
So another one came in from Mr. Trevor as well is, can you also ask about retail beef supply and price forecasts? Are prices expected to trend up or go back down or stay steady?
At the retail level, you know, I would expect that we'll continue to see some downward adjustment in those prices from the spike that we had really 2 months ago. They started coming down this last monthly data we had for July. The August data I would expect will show continued adjustment down for 2 reasons. One is, again, that spike was a very short run phenomenon. I don't want to call it artificial because it was real. There was very real reasons for that, given the disruption we had in supplies of beef, dating, you know, going back to April and May. But it was a very short run phenomenon and perceived to be that way. So I would expect those prices to continue adjusting down. Plus the fact that in the second half of the year, we're going to see year-over-year increases in beef production for the rest of the year. So we're going to be in bigger supplies anyway going forward. And that's one of my concerns, or at least one of the things I'm watching from a demand standpoint, is sort of, will we see bigger recessionary macroeconomic impacts on beef demand? Up to this point, we have not really seen as much as I might have expected at one point. And I think that's largely because we've had a lot of stimulus and other kinds of financial support up to this point in the market that have really kind of masked the underlying sort of macro shocks. We may not have that going forward. And so we may begin to see a little more of a kind of a macroeconomic pressure, unemployment type pressure, just lack of income on the part of consumers. And that could be a bigger issue in the fourth quarter as we go forward here through the fourth quarter than it was earlier. I don't see it yet, so I wouldn't say it's inevitable that we will see that, but it is one of the things that I'm watching as a potential kind of a concern going forward.
Okay. So when I looked over the polls, when I asked a few questions, so there is kind of a split that some of these folks are planning on selling the calves straight off the cows. And for the majority of them have not weaned the calf crop for 21 or more days traditionally, and kind of a split in regards to that they have participated in a special calf marketing sale. Could you touch a little bit about how, participating in a weaning program and what you see from the data there at Oklahoma State and across the nation, the benefits of weaning calves, and kind of touch a little bit about that from a marketing standpoint?
You bet. We've had a particular preconditioning type program, kind of an umbrella VAC 45 type program in Oklahoma for quite a few years now. So we've got lots of data. We track these sales every fall, and And so, you know, we've documented pretty clearly, and other folks have used, some other researchers have used Joplin sale data as well as Superior sale data. There's little doubt on average that there's a significant premium to these preconditioning programs. And it comes from that set of protocols that you do for preconditioning programs typically. The biggest one probably is the weaning component. That's what buyers will tell us. We've surveyed buyers. And in fact, Christy and I were talking about this earlier. In the last couple of years, we've seen that buyers, you know, it might be a back 45 program, which implies 45 days of weaning. That's almost become a minimum in terms of what they're looking for. And they're paying premiums above that for 60 or 75-day weaning kind of things. And so, and that's stemming from the fact that there's persistent health issues that these stocker and feedlots are facing. And, you know, there's a lot of frustration that they can't do a better job of controlling it. So they're really reaching back and just trying to get those calves to be healthier before they ever get them. So the weaning part of it, and then the other things you do. So you do the vaccination protocol, you do the bunk breaking and those kind of things, which have value. And our data clearly shows that on average, there is value to those preconditioning programs. That's true when prices are low, and it's true when prices are high. In 2015, when we had record high prices, we were concerned, or at least curious as to whether or not we would see premiums in that kind of a market, and we did continue to see premiums. And maybe it makes sense because those calves were so expensive, the value of better health may be higher to a buyer when they're high than when they're low in some sense. And so, so we've seen that. There's, you know, again, there's plenty of data to do that. Now, there are costs involved, obviously, in weaning. So, you know, and you're going to be selling a different animal. If you're used to selling them right off the cow, and that's at a certain weight, at a certain time of the year, typically, if you're going to wean them, you know, you may or may not change your weaning date if you're going to do a preconditioning program, I should say. But you're going to be selling them at a different time. You're going to be selling them at a different weight. And certainly there's some production costs. So you do have to do some figuring. And it's not 100% guaranteed, but our research would pretty clearly show that there is generally a payback to preconditioning programs.
So Les has chimed in here, and I think we just answered Les' question about concerns about preconditioning during weaning can improve prices to the cow-calf. So we've just touched on that. He himself has not found a marketing route for preconditioned calves. He has tried that for a few years, but couldn't find the premium paid. In the end, it didn't seem to pay. Yvonne has personally experienced that too over the last couple of years, and just that the buyers sale barn don't seem to care about those preconditioning calves. Is there a lot group or anything in regards to that kind of helps reach that premium? I mean, I sometimes think, you know, when we think about back in the day, we wind the clock back probably, what, 10, 15, 20 years ago, that a VAC 21 or a VAC 30 program was kind of our industry standard. And now that has bumped up to about a, you know, VAC 45 day. Could you kind of elaborate a little bit more on that information for us?
You bet. In fact, I'm glad that you brought that up because I forgot to mention that, you know, the preconditioning program that you do is a production activity. You got to do those things to actually implement preconditioning. The other half of it that is very important then is how and where you're going to market those calves. Because I think the observation is absolutely correct. If you take, you know, a smaller group or a single lot of preconditioned calves to sort of a normal sale that doesn't see very many of those kind of calves, I don't think you will get a premium. I think the buyers are not used to buying them. They don't necessarily have the ability to value those calves to their potential. So if you're going to think about doing a preconditioning program, you need to be looking around for somebody that's doing, you know, a special sale. Typically, if a sale barn or some other venue starts a new kind of a program, it typically takes 2 or 3 years to kind of get that in place. So the buyers are expecting it. The buyers who do value those calves and know what the value of those calves are will be there and be looking for those kind of cattle. And volume matters. I mean, those buyers, particularly if they're bigger calves, well, it doesn't matter. If they're shipping very far, we're going to be looking for pot loads. So we're going to be looking for truckload lots. If not from a single group, that would be the best potential, and our data reflects that. There is more value to larger lots of calves, but at least where they can put together a load of calves if they're going to be shipping them very far, whether it's farther west for stocker programs or whether it's all the way to a feedlot. And so, the total volume of a sale can matter. A single lot of calves mixed in with a lot of other calves probably won't generate a lot of premium. So you do have to kind of look for that marketing venue. It takes some work. It takes some work on the part of the sale to actually market these calves and attract the right kind of buyers. I agree with what I'm hearing here, that sometimes you don't see any premium. I can tell you in Oklahoma, I've also been to days when we had the preconditioned calf sale going on. And during the period when those calves would sell, we were reporting prices. And as soon as they announced that that was the end of the preconditioned calves, a significant percentage of the buyers get up and walk out. That's what they came there for. They were paying for them. And when it's done, they leave and they're going to look for the next place. So it works both ways. You got to find those places where the buyers are there and know what the value of those calves are to consistently get those premiums.
I always think about the philosophy is let's market our cattle before we go produce them to make sure that we're going to hit into the right market and have our marketing strategy put together. It's always been something that I've thought through, and that's what we do in our own personal operations. So one question that I would have for you when we think about, these special calf markets, is there a time of the year that we would see, because we start thinking September, October, we kind of get into our weaning time. Is there a time of weaning where we see a more premium paid than not? So if we're hitting into that wheat pasture or grass pasture, et cetera, is there any time frame there?
That's going to vary a little bit on the location, obviously the size of the calves as well, and obviously what they're going for. So if they're lightweight calves and they're likely to be going into a stocker type program, you could think about backing up from a winter grazing kind of a standpoint. In Oklahoma, we've looked at this, sort of the seasonality of our prices, and Arkansas won't be vastly different, I don't think. I'd have to go look at the numbers. Basically mid-November kind of time frame. Sometimes the first week of December is a pretty strong market. So you back up from there, then that puts you back to, 45 days, puts you back to weaning around the 1st October or something like that in many cases. Sometimes it's a little bit sooner than that. Now, obviously our normal overall seasonal price pattern is for the lowest prices to be in that October timeframe typically. So we're talking about sort of, the coming out of that in some sense by getting into November kind of timeframe. So I don't think there's a consistent answer to that. And it's going to depend a lot on the local situation, exactly where you're located.
Perfect. So I personally got a question in regards to the plants, the packing plants right now. I mean, are we up to full harvesting production there, or what's that looking like right now?
We're doing pretty good. Again, the packing plants have been running most weeks 1 to 1.5% below year-ago levels, and we compare to year ago partly because of the seasonality as we go through the year. But the fact of the matter is, had we not had all of the impacts we had, I don't know that we would have been expecting to be slaughtering even at year-ago levels through the summer. So, in other words, I think we're probably slaughtering, everything we intended to during that time frame. So, barring another major outbreak of the virus, and I don't think we'll see that. That's not to say we don't have continuing issues there, but we've learned enough about how to handle it. We've made, some interventions in those plants to decrease the likelihood that we're going to have problems. I don't think we're going to run into problems of anywhere near the kind of levels that we saw in April and May.
Oh, perfect. That's always good to know. So, And the yards are pretty current right now with cattle, and I mean being current on those cattle there too.
I think we're getting there. We don't have perfect data on that, but what I hear sort of anecdotally and what you can see in the numbers we have would tell me that we're probably pretty cleaned up on those big heavy cattle, the ones we carried over. You know, I can give you an example that I heard from a feedlot manager, and this is a smallish kind of independent lot a little while back, and he said, you know, from May to June, I carried over 2,500 head that didn't get marketed in May that should have. From June to July, I carried over about 1,700 head. From July to August, I carried over about 400 head. And so now we think about August into September. I think probably an awful lot of that has been cleaned up at this point. And again, I showed you earlier those lightweight or those slow placements in March and April, or February and March and April, I think it was, translate into, I hate to call it a whole, but a reduced number of cattle that would normally be coming out now. So we've had time to kind of get through all of that and get cleaned up. I think we're pretty current right now.
Good. Well, good. And it was amazing when you talked about the corn market, right? I mean, touched a little bit about that. And I think about all those acres that was lost up north, and it's good to know some of that information as well. So, any other final comments, Dr. Peel, that you would like to make? I know we're bumping here a little bit, but we had some really good questions that I felt that we needed to probably get addressed this evening.
No, that's it. I appreciate the questions. I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you. You know, again, we're still in a very, you know, broadly speaking, a very uncertain environment. There's lots of things that can jump up, and you know, the only way you can really sort of deal with that is just to try to stay as flexible and as nimble as you can, at least for short run kinds of things. But at the same time, I do think that we're sort of moving back to, again, I'm not going to call it normal. I don't know what that means now, but maybe business as usual in terms of kind of the way the various sectors of our industry typically work with each other. The price relationships are more or less back in line across, you know, calves, feeder cattle, fed cattle. And so I think you can kind of, you know, figure out what your plans are, both for this fall as well as maybe longer term. Proceed with those with a bit of caution and kind of keeping an eye on a lot of these bigger factors that could change our situation, and be prepared to adapt. But I think I would sort of figure out what it is my strategy is, and go ahead and move forward with that. And you know, maybe with some caution, but I think you can kind of go back. Maybe we'll be a little less on the defense for the next many months, as opposed to obviously most of the last year we've been kind of on defense, and certainly the last 6 months we've just been trying to weather the storm. And I'm hopeful that we can go back and think about what we really would like to do and start moving towards that.
Perfect. Well, I want to kind of finish this up. I'm going to take over the screen here real quick and let you folks know that if you pick up that lovely cell phone and text Purina to 95323, so that's the number we're going to text, 95323, in the body, we're going to put Purina. It will give you a link, and then you will select A, and then Arkansas, and then tonight it will be FCBB Cattle Market Update, and that will get you registered for a $10 off coupon that will come across in an email form. Folks, I know Dr. Peel, we've talked a little bit about weaning programs and such like that. Stop by any of your local 15 retail stores of the farmer cooperative locations across western Arkansas and into eastern Oklahoma, and these folks can visit with you. We appreciate Dr. Peel coming on tonight. Next week, or here in 2 weeks, I apologize, our next cattle series will be Dr. N.T. Cosby will be back on talking about weaning feed programs, and kind of ties back on to what Dr. Peel was talking about in regards to those values that we can help walk you through. And then we'll have another one on September the 29th to talk about total brood cow nutrition. If you guys have any equine sitting on your premises, Ty Cunningham is going to be joining us on September the 10th to talk about how do we evaluate that feed cost. And then Scott's going to be back on our program there in September, and I got to move my little cursor here, September the 17th, to talk about feeding our wildlife. So, folks, we appreciate you taking the time to join us tonight. Don't forget to drop on and text Purina 95323 to get that $10 off coupon that you can take it in. I want to leave with you guys that if you guys have any questions, I know Dr. Peel put up his contact information. I want you guys to have my contact information. I'm always just a phone call away or a text message away, however you guys prefer to communicate to me. My contact information is there. My cell phone number is 830-330-0902. And feel free to reach out. Dr. Peel, we appreciate you joining our program again. Know you brought us some very good information right when the CFAP was coming out. We appreciate you being involved in that the CFAP program as well to help us get some relief out here to our beef producers. So really appreciate everything that you do for us to support us in the beef industry, Dr. Peel.
Thank you very much. Anytime.
All right. Well, I think I don't have any other chat besides a guy telling me to, when I see him here next week, to have a conversation about some pre-con. So that's a great little lead off for me. So, Dr. Peel, we appreciate you so much, and we hope to see you soon.
You bet. Anytime. Let me know.
All right, guys. Thank you, guys. We'll see you guys on our next one.
Thanks.
Thank you.